Good afternoon. I am Mikko Myllykoski, the CEO of Heureka, the Finnish Science Center. At Heureka, we are honored and pleased to organize this event together with Faktabaari. Actually, it is hard to imagine an organization that would align more with our mission than Faktabaari. Together, we work for scientific literacy in the society. As a science center, Heureka supports schools and the formal education system, but also advocates and invites everybody for free choice learning through engaging and personal learning experiences. As we humans on an average spend only some 5% of our lifetime in formal education, it is easy to understand that formal schooling will never be enough for a scientifically literate population. We need also lifelong and lifelike learning, and we are one of the institutions for this kind of activity and endeavor. 2 weeks ago, Heureka received its 9th millionth visitor, but this success and popularity is not enough. We wish to broaden participation and reach out to communities that are underrepresented in our audiences at the moment. 2 years ago, we chose the concept of science capital as the framework for our future work. Later this afternoon, my colleague Kirsi Pulkkinen will address this issue more in detail. But I will stop here about Heureka, and I would like to wish you all an inspiring and rewarding webinar with our distinguished speakers. Let me now hand over to Faktabaari and Mikko Salo, who will present Faktabaari's view on this. Mikko, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you first of all, Mikko, for the hosting us, and this is really an honor for us. We will have Kari Kivinen soon presenting more the today's settings, but my role is more to welcome you to the Faktabaari. Our point is here to gather like-minded people for a very important mission we have all. Can I have my slides, please?
Yes, of course.
Just as a general introduction, before going to our educational activities, I could tell you a little bit more about Faktabaari turning from fact-checking, purely fact-checking service to something what we call digital information literacy. Here in these slides you can see also the hashtags for the social media use if you want to contribute to spreading the information on us. How Faktabaari sees our information environment nowadays is with this type of view. On the left-hand side, you will see our screenshot from our website and a mobile application website where you can kind of enter the world of Faktabaari in English or in Finnish. But what we try to cover when educating on digital information disorder is the classical information disorders, meaning misinformation, labeled here by the traffic lights and the colors. Then the disinformation, marked here by this warning sign. And finally, malinformation, that is symbolized here with this kind of not this direction mark. Next to that one, we try to bring it to the digital environment that amplifies our problems, unfortunately, with the systemic view. And here we refer to the manipulative online environment, mostly caused by the social media algorithms that we have to take into account when really seeing what are the challenges to us all, but in our focus especially to the youth, who are the heavy users for the social media and exposed to the algorithmic choices. We do it with traditionally have been doing it with and for educators. So we, as a small NGO, don't have resources to go to the students themselves. We try to empower the educators, be they teachers, mostly in our case, but why not parents and so on, to link and discuss the matters with the younger audiences. Here you see some of our references, the stories you can find on our website, when actually CNN made our voter literacy program very famous by spreading it through their exclusive reportage on a Finnish way of handling fake news, as they called it. And then we made an example of empowering youth by fact-checking one of their idols, Greta Thunberg, with two prominent Finnish independent scientists, who both in gross said that Greta has done her science homework. Some smaller problems, but overall the story was coherent and worth listening, and so making her a fact base like idol, at least in that famous statement she did in EU context 2019. And finally, one example is how we tried to help during the ongoing, let's say, infodemics, so the information overflow during the current and ongoing pandemic. We unfortunately need to still suffer for a while. We made some materials for the teachers to use in classrooms as they wish. Very good. We luckily don't need to do this all by ourselves, and we really appeal, of course, and give our materials for free to anybody for use. But these are some of the references that we contribute. One of the probably next steps is what we are doing with the European SchoolNet and some Belgium and Maltese colleagues within the project called Facts for All, Schools Tackling Disinformation, where we try to empower the school communities, not just teachers, but also the parents, to discuss disinformation, in that case mostly within the school community. Then, of course, our today's seminar that Kari will talk more with Jonathan, and then in the bigger scale and in Nordic scale, we try to liaise our efforts to a new initiative, European initiative, where we have a Nordic consortium to tackle digital information disorders, and within that project we are developing further our information literacy approach. This program is supported with our partner Sitra. But I think with further ado, we actually go towards today's session, and this is something we have co-organized together with the Stanford Expert Group, Teaching Critical and Evaluative Thinking in Science, or more specifically Jonathan Osborne, Professor Jonathan Osborne, who is chairing the group, and where we try to address how can science education and educators contribute to fact-based public debate and tackling disinformation. The forthcoming report will be much broader, but this is the kind of angle that links us both. We will be talking about critical reading in digital information environment, and probably comparing different cultural backgrounds a bit, and go for this kind of mutual learning in post-truth societies. In short, our aim is to gather like-minded projects. So next to Jonathan and the Stanford Expert Group, we have invited two major project called Critical and Finsky, They will represent themselves, and they will contribute to the same matter, and we try to pool our resources. And finally, we thank once again Heureka for hosting us, and our co-sponsors to enable Jonathan's visit to Finland, US Embassy, and the NGO that Avoin Yhteiskunta ry that is behind the Faktabaari. But let's keep in mind we are doing this for the students, so that should be kept in mind when we, let's say, adults and older people mostly talk about that one. Please join the debate with the Faktabaari hashtag, and you can also retrospectively send us email to the email address you can find from our website. During the session, we will also liaise to a very important session for the Finnish science educators in 15 minutes or something like that, 20 minutes. So that might cause a little delay in the program, but we will sort it out somehow in order to make impact and in order to make Jonathan's contribution especially available to all. And finally, the session will be also recorded, so you can come back to the different parts. So once again, very much welcome to Faktabaari. And now I give the floor to Kari Kivinen, who is presenting our digital information literacy, and then the next speakers after that. Thank you.
Good afternoon from Heureka, and thanks for both Mikkos. It's really a pleasure to be here today. We could go to my slides now. I will open a little bit what is digital information literacy. And let's start with a very simple thing. If you have any browser or any search engine, try to put any word there and you get millions of hits. I did this a few times ago, and with the word vaccine, I got 240,000 million results in 0.6 seconds. This is wonderful. We have wonderful amount of information available for us in every pocket, in every device. The real problem is which one of these hits is matching my information needs. Which one of these is something which is valid for me, information that I really would like to find. So that's the real thing. Out of millions of hits, we as individuals, we have the task to ourselves to kind of figure out which is the information, and we need skills to be able to do it. So when we are speaking about information, we need a set of skills and abilities to do any kind of search, how to discover, access, interpret, analyze, manage, create, communicate, store, and share information in the digital environment. For that, we need ability to think critically and ability to make balanced judgments about information we use, whether or not the materials under the analysis are valid, accurate, acceptable, reliable, appropriate, useful, or persuasive. And this is very much linked also for democracy and for being fully engaged citizens in a society. There are loads of terms about online literacies, and I will explain here a few of them. So first of all, Finnish curricula has a very broad term called multiliteracy. In the Anglo-Saxon countries, very often it's used media and information literacy, MIL. For example, UNESCO is using this term to flag the media and information literacy. Because we are based on the fact-checking organization, we are mainly interested on how the information part of the MIL can be tackled. And information literacy is developed by librarians long time ago. And if you go to any library in the world, if you are looking for a book on mammals or animals, the librarian will tell you exactly where to find the right information and the right book. Libraries have different kind of systems where this can be facilitated. Now, our library is online. It's digital, and we don't have librarian telling us which is the right shelf to find the information we are looking for. And that's why we are speaking of specific skills related to online environment, and we call that digital information literacy. There are a lot of other terms like social media literacy, data literacy, algorithm literacy, and it's also linked to the privacy awareness. In this conference, you will hear about critical reading, and the European Commission, for example, is using digital literacy. But in the end, we mean the same thing, how to help citizens to find the information which they are looking for. The problem is that online environments and the platforms, they are not really made and the purpose that they are facilitating the finding of the information in a transparent way. Because of different types of algorithms, different types of ways the environments are coded, they are made to maximize sometimes commercial interest. They are made to capture and sustain our attention by providing us interesting hints, interesting materials to keep us hooked. They are collecting data out of us, which they are selling for the advertisers in order to predict and influence the future. For example, behavior of buying things on the Black Friday. And I have not yet touched the subject of mis, dis, and malinformation. It is challenging to find the information from the online environment because of the overwhelming amount of information. But the problem is that partially inside of the correct information, there are misinformation, which is a false information which is shared but no harm is meant, disinformation, which is false information shared knowingly to cause harm, or the malinformation, which is maybe correct information, but it's shared against the person's wish in order to make some damage. And this all is linked to the danger of democracy. Because the health of the democracy depends on the people's ability to access reliable information. For example, to be able to vote correctly in the elections. And in the online environment, the traditional gatekeepers are largely absent. For example, in the printed media in Finland, there is a quite good ethical responsibility for the reporters, journalists, and also for the publishers. But in the online, this is missing in many parts. So what can be done? And this slide is taken from the Kosirova et al. Citizen versus the Internet presentation. And they have proposed that there are 4 different angles and intervention corners to do something, to change the laws and regulations, publish ethical guidelines. Technology, the technology which is used by maybe providing harmful material can be also used for other purposes. On the way here, we used Navigator, and navigators are seldom, the algorithms are seldom proposing disinformation. Otherwise, people won't use it. Then there is psychological and social science. We need new kind of traffic rules on online environment, and we should study it much more. And we will hear today 2 presentations about the research which is going on that level. And education, which is close to our heart. How we can improve the school curricula for digital information literacy. If we are starting from the European level, the European Union has launched the Digital Education Action Plan, which is quite ambitious. And for example, myself, I'm a member of the expert group on tackling disinformation and promoting digital literacy in education. We have had 2 meetings with 25 experts, and we will publish recommendations, let's say, earliest next summer or next September. There is DITSCOMP 2.2. For the first time, there are media and information literacy competencies there, which will be proposed for the member states and educational organizations to be applied. It will be published in February next year. So there are a lot of things happening on the European level. In the Finnish level, we have already a curriculum which contains in a cross-curricular area multiliteracy, thinking and learning to learn, ICT competencies. So in Finland, the curricula is not preventing us to go deeper into digital literacy. There is also a very new movement. It's called New Reading Skills, uudet lukutaidot, and you can see the competencies which are starting from the pre-primary, going to the end of fundamental education in several areas. Here is an example of information management, and already on early education, children are kind of familiarizing themselves with the basic use of browser. And it ends up at the age of 15 when students are able to do much more, and they are able to interpret information on the net. In Faktabari Edu, we have been working with the students and with the teachers, and we have kind of identified 10 different streams where we should work a little bit more. First of all, the online and offline environments are different. The behavior in the online environment is different. Offline environments, we have mainly printed media, books, magazines, journals, etc. When online information, like I said, there is a lot of materials which are not published by anybody, but they are put forward. Then development, how to promote development of critical thinking skills, strategic ignorance and lateral reading. I will come back to that. We recommend also that invite to schools experts, media experts, researchers, journalists. We will discuss today a lot that science is much more than an opinion, and how we could teach students to find out which experts are reliable, which sources are reliable, which articles are reliable. We have provided different types of checklists used by the fact-checkers, kind of online environmental traffic rules, which Mikko spoke already. How to deal with confusing contents, for example, conspiracy theories, to be more aware about algorithms, and then, very important part, how to verify the authenticity of the photos and videos. It's a growing need. And last but not least, how to take care of our privacy and our digital footprint. What do we want others to know about ourselves? And because of that, we have created all kind of materials for teachers and also for students. And we are in the opinion that in spite of the good curricula, there is a huge need for upskilling of our teachers. There is a need for proper tools and methods to deal with the information disorder. And this is something we should take very seriously. We should also continue to promote the critical thinking skills. And this doesn't mean that we are absolutely negative on everything, but it's kind of formulating balanced and analytical judgments about the things we are looking at. And I would like to raise the issue that in our trainings we have had a lot of mother tongue and history teachers or social science teachers, but not really science teachers. And today you will hear soon the testimony of Jonathan Osborne, who will say that actually science knowledge is really needed to tackle disinformation linked to the scientific claims. Few words about the strategic ignoring. There are so much information online environment that we have to learn to pass by the information which is not really worth reading. And there are different ways of doing it, and I will not go much further to that, but the idea that not all the information is equal on value, it's important, and we should look for the information which is really important for us. And what we can learn from the fact-checkers is these kind of lateral reading skills, that instead of starting to jump to the first text we find online, we should first check who is behind the information, what is the evidence, and what do other sources say. I would like to warmly recommend the fact-checkers against the disinformation database, because this opens the eyes to see how disinformation is spreading around the world very rapidly, that there is a claim popping out in Mexico, next time in Southern America, maybe going to Portugal, then finally coming to Finland. And in this international database, you can follow the disinformation going from place to place. We will be publishing the sources of our presentations. We want to be transparent so that you have time to look at them carefully. You have time to learn, to check it yourself, because we don't want you to take granted what we say. But it's better to check it. Now the next point will be quite interesting. We will have Professor Jonathan Osborne from the Stanford University, who has coordinated a group of experts from all over the world, who have been diving to find out how to improve the science teaching in order to tackle disinformation, and especially how to tackle the disinformation which is kind of based on scientific or pseudo-scientific claims. And we have this pleasure to have Luma Network joining us in 1 minute time. So there might be a little switch of problem, because we are moving from streaming to the other kind of platform. But don't get worried. Stay tuned and you will have the continuation. Since last January, I have had a pleasure to work with Professor Osborne and his team, and I have had an absolutely pleasure to listen to the very valuable discussions. And the thing I learned from them is that, yes, it's important to promote digital literacy, multiliteracy, different type of literacies. But if we don't have the scientific basics on these basic competencies, it's very difficult to tackle the disinformation which is using scientific claims. And we will hear now, starting from any second, what is going to be the presentation of Mr. Osborne. Mikko, may I ask what is the situation there in the Luma meeting?
We are practically ready to continue as you want.
Yeah. So I would like to propose to switch the places with Professor Osborne. Welcome. And I would like to welcome also the Luma people to listen to this direct sending from Heureka. Mr. Osborne, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're ahead? Okay, great, fine. Thank you very much for attending online. I'm sorry I can't be doing this in person, but I'm delighted that you've come to listen to me, and I hope I've got something valuable to say. The basic title of what I'm talking about is, wait a minute, okay. I'm calling it Science Education for a Post-Truth Society. And the label post-truth, I think, is being used to reflect that I think we're all confronted by a very rapidly changing society where all kinds of we are provided with all kinds of information. Basically, we're awash in a sea of information. And I think the evidence is pointing to the fact that most of our youth have no basic navigational qualifications. And you could also say that about a lot of adults as well. And the consequence of that is that they are tending to believe all kinds of things which are dubious, and there is an undermining of the trust in science. And the responsibility for that or remediating for that, must fall on those who are engaged in teaching science and educating people about science, because the failure to do this is to do a disservice to science, and that is, I think, ultimately to do a disservice to the societies in which we live. And I want to make that kind of argument, basically, and talk about what it is that we can do in science, because I think the kinds of things we can do in science education require some kind of rethinking of what we value. So, who has been involved in this project? Well, basically, this project was initiated by Bruce Alberts, who used to be the editor of Science. He's a leading member of the science community in the US. And he basically was worried and concerned, I think, about the way in which science has been called into question, particularly in the recent pandemic with all the issues around vaccines and masks. And he convened with Janet Coffey from the Moore Foundation, who have funded this work. He asked me to lead a group of people, and this is the list and group of people. It's a mix of people who are engaged in science, philosophy of science. For instance, Douglas Allchin is a philosopher of science. Some of them are undergraduate science educators. Carl Bergstrom, for instance, has written a book called Calling Bullshit. Saul Perlmutter is a Nobel Prize winner who's written a book or developed a course called Sense and Sensibility of Science. And then, of course, in fact, you have Kari Kivelin, from Faktabari in Finland. And there are other people here who work in science. And we have met over the past 6 months, basically still in ongoing meetings, to discuss what the issue is, to look at the different kinds of approaches, and to generate some kind of report. Basically, our goal with this is to generate a kind of policy statement for the science education community, arguing why this matters and why we really have to do something about it. And our kind of model for this is previous reports that have come out of the UK. One of them was by Paul Black, my colleague, called Inside the Black Box. And another one is the one that I was involved in, called Beyond 2000 Science Education for the Future, that some people may know about. So our goal in the next 3 to 4 months is to produce some kind of similar report as well, arguing the case for why this matters, because we do obviously think that it matters. Now, in making this case, we have drawn on a lot of what you might call academic work. These are some of the kinds of articles. Douglas Allchin and Dietmar Hotke's work on reconceptualizing the nature of science education. Clark Chin and Sarek Baselet's work on education for a post-truth world. And the one that Kari's already mentioned, Anastasia Kozreva and her colleagues, on citizens versus the internet, confronting digital channels with cognitive tools. I think the thing to take note of here is that this, in the past 4 or 5 years, has gained a lot of attention, because there is a lot of concern out there about the way in which some of this misinformation is undermining what you might call the civil nature of democratic societies. And we start from the premise, and I think this is the important premise, that true knowledge is a collective good, because basically it enables us to act in an informed way. And therefore it's tremendously important that people draw on what we call true knowledge in making their decisions and informing their actions. The question to be asked, of course, is how do you make sure that they reliably get that? And we have 4 questions, really. First of these questions is, why is this competence to evaluate expertise and information needed? You might say that's obvious, but nevertheless it's part of our argument. What is the evidence they actually struggle with that? And I'll come to each of these questions in turn. Okay, why should science education, and those who are science educators listening to this might think, well, this is fine, but it's not really my concern. It's civics education. Why should science education be bothered about this in that sense? And if it should be bothered, our last question, what can be done in science education to develop the ability to evaluate scientific information? Because much of this misinformation has a scientific quality to it, and to do it competently as well. So those are our questions. So let's turn to the first of these questions. Why is this competence to evaluate expertise and information needed? Okay, well, I don't really think this needs a very strong argument, but this is the kind of way of summarizing it. This is the contemporary challenge. You've seen it extremely prominent and coming to the fore in the past 2 years with the pandemic. All kinds of competing claims in the community, and many of these claims calling on the language of science to try and convince people that they basically are capable of making the decision for themselves, and that they are sufficiently informed, or that they are being deluded in some kind of way by scientists. So this is the challenge. How do you sort out, in some senses, the wheat from the chaff? How do you make it clear what's trustworthy knowledge and what's unreliable knowledge? And this has been characterized by various reports. This is one of them, as that we are living in an era of truth decay, where truth is less valued than it was. What matters is not so much what you might call objective truth. What matters, in some senses, is what the values and beliefs of the community you have in that sense. And this has led to the notion of post-truth. So out there, you can find all kinds of misinformation. This is just a sample of them. For instance, there's still a prominent number of people who believe that the Earth is flat, that ivermectin can cure you or prevent you from getting COVID-19. Moon landing was a hoax. That one's been going on for a long time. Masks are ineffective at preventing the spread of COVID-19, or that climate change is not anthropogenic. And you find that, okay, in all kinds of sources, but particularly this kind of tweets. And some of this, okay, goes beyond what I call misinformation. Misinformation is just simply knowledge that's passed on that happens to be wrong. The people who passed it on didn't know or don't know that it's wrong. Disinformation is spread deliberately for some kind of political or financial agenda in that way, for people to make profit out of it. And being aware of that distinction, I think, is important. And the situation, I think, in some senses, has got to the point where this cartoon characterizes it, the level of concern about it, in that sense, where you can see misinformation as the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, in that sense, along with war, famine, pestilence, and death. You might say that's putting it a little bit radically, but the position I think we're in as a group of experts in the community is this is something serious. It is not something that we can pass off and wait to pass. It's something that we have to do something about, and not doing something about it, okay, is problematic. The question you've got to ask, in fact, then, is what should science do about it? You're in a situation where, in some senses, expertise, or the value placed on expertise, has diminished. This is a very readable book by Tom Nichols, who bemoans this fact arguing things like, I'm still deeply concerned that we are headed into even darker days for logic, reason and knowledge, and consequently the kind of reasoned debate that sustains democratic societies. And this is, in some senses, a very, what could you almost say, irony, because actually we're living in societies which are more and more complex, where are dependent on more and more specialist knowledge. We are all intellectually dependent on experts. Every time you basically go out there on the road, get on a train, get in a plane, you are dependent on people who know things you do not know that enable that system to run. That's just transport systems. Think about health systems. Think about energy systems. Okay? All of us depend on the experts who run those kinds of systems. And what you're seeing emerging, I think, is a concern about this in a range of books. Science Under Fire by Andrew Jewett, a book by Gloria Origi on reputation and how basically people make judgments on the basis of reputation rather than evidence, and Steven Pinker's book on rationality, what it is, why it seems scarce and why it matters. Those are some of them. And the responses to that, in some senses, are books on courses organised by people like Carl Bergstrom, who is a member of our group, on calling bullshit. Sam Weinberg, who was also a member of our group, colleague at Stanford, on civic online reasoning. Do look them up. They've got, and of course, the work done by Factabari on fact-checking for educators and future voters. That's some of the work in that sense. And then there is also a very long and lengthy response published recently by the National Academy of Education on civic reasoning and discourse. They too are concerned about it. That's a very academic treatise on it, but it's downloadable, and obviously it goes into this issue in some depth. Okay, so that, I think, is a kind of argument for why it is that this is an important issue. Okay, I'll get to the issue of why it matters for science education in a moment. Briefly, I want to try and answer this kind of question. What evidence is there that students struggle to evaluate information successfully? Because I think a lot of us think, well, these young people, they're growing up in this kind of sea of digital media all the time. Every time you get on any piece of public transport, or if you're in a family, they seem to be fixated or hooked to this. Surely they're acquiring this expertise en passant, or they're learning from each other. Would that it was so. Sadly, that is not the case, because the research evidence is that students are poor at evaluating sources of information. They make what you might call fundamental basic mistakes. They think, for instance, that if his site's got .org on it, it's a reputable website. I'm sorry, but nothing could be further from the truth. Some .orgs are reputable, and some .orgs are simply disreputable, and that doesn't help you as a criterion for discriminating. They tend to evaluate the page, so they start by looking and reading the page and seeing what kind of information is it, and they get duped, many people get duped into thinking that they are capable of doing that and that they will understand the evidence in that kind of way. This is the wrong thing to do. Expert fact-checkers do not stay long on the page. They open another tab and check out the source and check out what they can find out about that source of information. And only when it passes those tests do they come back and look at the page itself and start to evaluate the evidence. So basically, that is the a priori ability and competency we must teach. They also tend to use reputation as the basis of epistemic trust. They trust something because it came from their friend, or they trust something because it came from a community that they're engaged in. And they distrust things that come from people that they don't know. That is not the criterion you should be using to establish trust in science. Okay. The criterion you should be using to establish trust in science, I'll come to shortly, are something that you need to know about and to be taught. And the last point, as a point made, you need these because we are epistemically dependent. All the time, we have to make judgments based on our trust in expertise. For instance, I suspect most of this audience, in fact I hope all of this audience, believe that climate change is an anthropogenic effect. Next question I will ask you is, how many of you have actually read the evidence? And I suspect if you're like me, you haven't read the evidence, and your trust is based on something else. Okay, this is another piece of evidence to show that the problem This comes from Sam Weinberg's research. And it just, I think, illustrates it. As researchers have shown, such claims persist despite a 2019 national survey of 3,446 high school students that revealed major deficiencies in evaluating the credibility of online sources. 52% said that a Facebook video claiming to show ballot stuffing during the 2016 Democratic primary elections, a video that actually came from Russia, a fact easily established by searching for a 2016 voter fraud video, constituted strong evidence of US voter fraud, yet 9 out of 10 students were unable to come up with a cogent rationale for rejecting the video. And that's posing a threat to our democratic societies. And that, I think, is at the basis of the concern that most of us actually have. So this group considered this and said, well, what are the kinds of issues that mattered, and how, if these are the issues that matter, what can we do about them? And basically, we came up with this list, essentially, of things that we thought were important. Digital media literacy, the kind of things that Carrie's talking about. Valuing truth. That, I think, is something which we have to imbue into science education, that this is an important value. An understanding of uncertainty, the role of expertise in making judgments, the kinds of errors that we all as humans make when we reason, and we do make them commonly, how you establish credibility in a source, how we establish reliability and trustworthiness of scientific knowledge, what consensus is in science, how it's achieved and why it matters, and then this kind of social and collaborative nature of science. And basically what we're arguing for when we come to answering our third question is that there needs to be a much more of an emphasis on the social structures in science that enable it to produce trustworthy knowledge. So, going on, why science education? Why can't this be done somewhere else in civics? Well, first of all, many of these issues are science related. And if they're science related, there's a kind of obvious inference that the context in which they should be discussed and how they should be decided should be in the science lesson. And science education, okay, has a duty and responsibility, along with all other disciplines, to develop the competency to do this. You might say, okay, that in some senses, well, competency is important, but you can't wash your hands of it and then say, we don't need to do anything about it. Because you're making an assumption that somebody else is doing something about it, and you're making an assumption that they understand enough of what the social structures of science are to be able to educate their students. And I don't think they do. Because much of the information that's needed is essentially science specific. And these are the kinds of issues that you need to understand in coming to a judgment about a science-related claim. First of all, you need some kind of evaluation of science expertise. Who is this person, or who is this body that is making this claim? In what sense are they, you might say, a benevolent source who is interested in advancing your understanding of the truth? Or are they offering you what you might call a distorted version of the truth? You need to understand some of the ways in which scientific knowledge is constructed and vetted to minimize error. That means some understanding of what actually is quite a complex process, peer review, but at least a minimal understanding of how it works and why it matters. Most of all, though, you need some understanding of the importance of scientific consensus. Science is not a democracy where all voices are equal. What happens in science, basically, is that findings around a question accumulate over a period of time, and gradually, in fact, as more and more findings emerge, and that they all are saying the same kind of thing, scientific consensus emerges. And if there's a scientific consensus, if somebody's calling that into question, they can legitimately call it into question, but it's really, in fact, they're putting themselves, you might say, beyond the boundary of what all other scientists think, and whether their information should be credible is highly questionable. And you also need to have some kind of understanding of the role of error in science. Science does make mistakes, but it's also got these self-correcting mechanisms for eliminating error. So these are the kinds of things, and that, I think, answers my question. those kinds of things should be taught in science. Where else would they be taught? And therefore, we as a science community have a responsibility to do that. The other things I think in some senses, the last thing I'd say is important, is that we need to build some kind of sense of intellectual humility. Many of the ideas that we put forward in science are enormous intellectual achievements, just from the idea that day and night is caused by a spinning Earth. After all, if you look out the window, it's patently obvious that the sun moves, to the idea that you look like your parents, because every cell in your body carries a chemically coded message about how to reproduce you. Now, these things didn't emerge overnight. They weren't the result of some kind of simple experiment. They were a result of years and years of thought and hard work. And when confronted with scientific claims, that needs some kind of understanding of what's gone into it in that kind of way. Okay, so what can be done in science education then to develop the ability to evaluate scientific information and expertise competently? And this, I think, is obviously, you might hopefully come with me to say, well, okay, maybe science education should do something about this. But what can we do after all? We've got enough on our plate already. The curriculum's absolutely full with too much. Well, I agree science curricula are full with too much, and that is an issue which science curricula have, I think, failed to deal with in what you might call a coherent manner for a long period of time. And all I am doing, I think, and I think legitimately doing, is saying, for once, you really do have to think about this, because your failure to do anything about this, if you're involved in science education, is a failure to science. And scientists out there themselves have to do something about it, because they are worried about the lack of trust in science. So these are the generic kinds of things that we can teach with simple exercises over the years. One of them is lateral reading. This is the idea that when you land on a page, okay, what you have to do, or when you click restraints, the other thing, when you put a question into Google, you get a list of sources. What the sources you get depends upon what question you put in. And therefore, again, the thing that comes at the top isn't necessarily the best thing to answer it. So expert fact checkers do not click on the one that comes at the top straight away. They read through them, looking for the one that actually might be the most useful before they click. When they get onto that page, they don't spend long on it, because the first question they're asking is this source trustworthy? And therefore they leave the page and do searches looking at the source and seeing what they can find out. They use, for instance, Wikipedia to establish whether there is a scientific consensus. Wikipedia is good when there is a significant issue which lots of research has been done on. So look at the issue, obviously, of masks, look at the issue of climate change. Wikipedia will give you good answers to your questions on that. They use fact-checking websites, Snopes.com, sourcewatch.org, which have professional fact-checkers in that sense, and they'll use those to check out sources. And the reason you need to do these strategies rather than some of the existing checklists that exist, there's a notorious one in the US which goes by the interesting acronym of CRAP, which stands for Currency, Relevance, Authority, Accuracy and Purpose. And the research evidence shows that if you use that, you'll still be deceived by duplicitous information. So we have to educate students in these techniques. Those are the generic techniques. What do we have to actually do in science? These are the things we have to teach them about. We have to teach them about the importance of scientific consensus. Science puts a premium on intersubjective agreement. When there's a consensus, okay, basically science moves on saying it has established knowledge beyond doubt. It doesn't mean that it may not be called into question, that it can be called into question, but basically the body of evidence is so overwhelming that nobody's really calling it into doubt any longer. And that you need to understand. So one lone voice in the wilderness calling into doubt, okay, is not really worthy of your attention. 10 lone voices in the wilderness, then it gets a little bit more interesting. But in that case, there's not a consensus. And if there's not a consensus, then in some senses the best thing to do is to keep an open mind in that kind of way. as Christopher Hutchins said, that which can be asserted with evidence, without evidence, can also be refuted without evidence. And so evidence is tremendously important, and the consensus of evidence is tremendously important. You need to have some understanding, as I said, of peer review and the mechanisms of vetting by peers which go on. This is quite important. You need to have some understanding of scientific expertise and what it means to be an expert, and in particular you need to understand that somebody who is an expert in one discipline of science, for instance radiology, is not an expert in epidemiology, and therefore they have no legitimate expertise to question other scientists outside their discipline. This is tremendously important because this technique of calling science into question using scientists who have no expertise in the discipline has been used by the tobacco industry, by the oil industry, and I can't think of the climate change deniers, okay, as well. And you need to understand that. There are other people who have other relevant expertise because they work in the field, say midwives, okay, from that point of view, or farmers or fishermen. They are people who have expertise built out of experience. They could be listened to. But these are the things that you can teach in science. More specific science elements, we need to attend to the teaching about uncertainty. Uncertainty is an intrinsic feature of science. And we can never be absolutely confident about anything, but science has ways of minimizing uncertainty, from the very basic stuff of taking averages to the much more complex stuff of doing statistical measurements about probabilities. There's a distinction between cause and correlation, and you need to be wary about those two and how those are abused, and we need examples of their abuse. And then there are these errors in human reasoning that we make, particularly confirmation bias is one of the things that we look for sources that confirm our views, and we don't look for sources that challenge our views. That would be true about, I'm afraid, a lot of politicians as well, but it also happens in science. Intellectual humility is something I'm conscious I really just want to whip on, and I will not read that long quote from that point of view, but I think the main point I want to make here is that there is a distinction between knowledge and information. Information is something you can get out of Google. Knowledge is something you need to understand it. Knowledge is based on a coherent network of interrelationships that you understand. And that is built up over time. And yes, that's something that science education attempts to achieve, but there are limits to what we can do in the time that we have. And that you need to be aware of that distinction and have some recognition of the fact that we are flawed as human beings, we make mistakes, and therefore we should not believe things without evidence. I'm going to skip this slide, I'm afraid, because of the time, but this is a problem in the American curriculum, which obviously doing this work in America, we do have to refer to that from that point of view. But I think this is also true to some extent of other curricula as well. So let me come on to finish with the policy implications. And I need to be blunt about these, I think, in some senses. The things I've been arguing for are tremendously important. They are the competencies that all citizens and all scientists require. And because they're important, I argue that they have to have priority over teaching things like Ohm's law, the chemical structure of benzene, or the distinction between chromosomes, chromatin and chromatid. Those kinds of pieces of information are unlikely to be useful again ever in your life unless you happen to be a practicing scientist in that particular discipline. The things I'm talking about will be basically useful for the rest of your life. And if that means sacrificing some of what you might call the shibboleths of current science curricula, so be it in that sense. It means, I think, from a policy, science education needs to try and offer a more social perspective on science, how it functions as a community. That's something which it fails to do at the moment. It needs to put flesh on the bare bones of what is practice aid in the next generation science standards of obtaining, evaluating and communicating information. That is not done well. In the next round of PISA, there will be a new competency called research, evaluate and obtain information for decision making and action. And this is something that will be assessed in PISA. And it's clearly something that any next iteration of standards hopefully should attend to. This is the argument that we're trying to make. It means educating science teachers about what needs to be communicated and why it matters. I mean, all of what I'm saying basically will fall on stony ground if somehow or other it doesn't get through to teachers that this is something that needs to be done. It means a focus on error, and that means, I think, a shift in assessment. Rather than getting students to reproduce the right answer all the time, we need to get them questions which ask them to spot the flaw, spot the error in this particular piece of reasoning. Because only by doing that do you, I think, get people to be more circumspect about lots of information that they're actually getting. So that's a rather kind of brief run through about this kind of report that we're working on. I think many of you might have seen a summary of it. We are hoping to produce the full thing with a much more extended argument in the next 3 months, and I will offer it for wider circulation there. But I'm very happy to answer any questions, and I hope I've given you a sense of what the work we're doing is and why I think it matters, and hopefully you think likewise. But I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was very, very interesting, very important. And I would like to pass the message now to the Luma people that if you want to follow the follow-up, we are continuing the broadcasting here from Heureka. There will be Karita Kiili from the University of Tampere presenting the critical group findings and approach, and then Kirsi Pulkkinen from Finski, who is going to promote that. You can find the link from the chat, and if you don't go to that, go faktapari.fi, and you can see that there is a window which you can click and you can continue. So thank you, Jonathan. I have one question to you.
Right.
You said 3-4 months.
Yeah.
We have been working with the report quite a long time.
Yeah.
What is still to come? What do you expect? What kind of recommendation add-ons? Because this was already a quite heavy message.
Yeah, I don't think what comes out of it, the recommendations will be fundamentally different. I think what will come out of it, it will be a much more detailed argument for why these things matter. So as a group, you can imagine, and particularly a kind of group of experts like this, we have lots of, I think, not disagreements about the main messages, but disagreements about the tenor, the kinds of reasons, the rationales, what things are put, are given preeminence or less preeminence, how they're said. So those are the kinds of things. And having read through the feedback about the first draft of our report and looked at the comments, most of them have been very thoughtful and insightful, and they will improve the quality of our argument so that hopefully the evidence is better and the argument is better, so that it will be more convincing to more people.
Okay, and we will distribute it for the Luma community also. There is a question coming from how about people not interested on the or feel lack of scientific literacy in STEM subject?
That's a good question. My response to that is that in some senses we all have lack of literacy in STEM subjects. I am not an expert on climate change. I am not an expert on vaccines, in that sense. I am not an expert on how to live an environmental lifestyle. Many of us, for instance, in the environmentally supportive lifestyle, many of us in the next 5 to 10 years will make decisions about buying electric cars. Is buying an electric car a good thing? Certain people are saying it is, but then what about all the issues with the batteries, those kinds of things? So if I've got those questions, and hopefully I think most of us are confronted with those questions in one way or another in our daily life, then what I'm going to do is research the information that exists, and the obvious place I'm going to go and do that is on the internet. And then when I get these sources, I'm going to need to evaluate, should these sources be trusted? What's the nature of the scientific consensus about electric cars? Are these a good thing or not? And what are the reasons they're giving? Is anybody calling it into question? Who's calling it into question? So the fact that I'm not particularly interested in STEM subjects, and to be quite honest, I think the way, I can't speak for Finland obviously, but I can speak for the way a lot of it's taught across the globe, a lot of students are not particularly interested. is neither really here nor there. What I want out of my science education is something that's of enduring value, that helps me to engage with science. And I'm going to argue that some of the things that I'm putting forward, the development of these kinds of competencies, the development of this kind of knowledge, will help me when it comes to engaging with science. And that, therefore, ultimately is something, as a student, I would thank my science education for.
Thank you, Jonathan. We have time to move on.
Yeah.
And thanks for Luma people for being here. And join our streaming, because now we are letting Karita Kiili from University of Tampere loose. She's telling about what critical does.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks.
Hei vaan kaikille. Sorry, it was English. Hello everyone and good afternoon. My name is Karita Kiili and I come from Tampere University and I'm representing Critical Project. And if I can get my slides. And our aim in Critical Project is educate critical readers. And we are part of the literacy program, which concerns information literacy and evidence-informed decision-making. And this program is funded by Strategic Research Council. And there are 5 projects in this program, and Critical is one of them, and Finski is the other one, and will be represented after Critical. And in Critical we have 4 teams representing Tampere University, University of Jyväskylä, University of Helsinki and University of Oulu. And Critical's research and interaction activities aim at supporting children and adolescents' critical reading skills and throughout this schooling. And we hope that after the school years, these critical reading skills can protect them from mis- and disinformation that is spreading online. And in our project, critical reading refers to analyzing, evaluating, and interpreting written and multimodal texts. So we recognize the various types of texts. And we investigate students' critical reading skills, and we are also interested in what kinds of factors support these skills. And our aim is also to develop and test research-based educational practices and digital learning materials for critical reading education. But in addition to targeting for adolescents, we are also wanting to develop teacher education, because teachers are crucial educating our adolescents. So we are, for example, developing and testing a teacher education course to prepare our forthcoming teachers to support their students' critical reading development. And finally, we want to provide new knowledge and recommendations for policymakers and practitioners so that they can support students' critical reading. And our aims are actually well aligned with the National Reading Strategy that was announced last month. And there are some issues that I have picked from the strategy. So we should, according to strategy, supporting reading should be throughout our lifespan. It supports citizens' well-being, our society's equity and equality. And the strategy also recognizes the diversity of literacy environments and diversity of different types of texts, as well as the reading engagement. And the core concept in the strategy is multiliteracy, and it stems from our national curriculum. And there are a lot of important goals in this national reading strategy. So we need, as a society, a joint enterprise of different stakeholders to reach these goals of the strategy. And for critical, it was very important that the strategy also recognizes the importance of critical reading. And here are some issues that we are doing research in our project. We are interested how well students of different ages can evaluate the credibility of online texts, and also what kinds of home literacy practices supports children and adolescents' critical reading development, and how gamification can support critical reading skills, and how the motivational factors are associated the students' reading skills. And we are also wanting to understand how well our students can evaluate misleading diagrams. Actually, there is already a lot going on in our project, so there is a glimpse to ongoing research. At the moment, we are doing data collection to assess and understand adolescents' critical reading skills, and particularly critical online reading skills and reading of crafts. And we are looking also how these home literacy practices are related to students' performance. And we are using some instruments that we have either developing or further developing in the program. And for example, I have been developing this critical online reading assessment that I called CORA. And it is designed to measure students' abilities to analyze and evaluate online texts that vary in their quality. And the CORA is an online environment where students read 4 online texts. All the topics are health related, what we have now. For example, one topic is sugar effects. And we have manipulated different credibility aspects of the texts. For example, the text genre. So we have a personal blog, newspaper article, popular science text, and commercial texts. And we have also manipulated author's expertise, author's benevolence, and quality of evidence in these texts. And through these manipulations, we can assess different skills. We can understand how well students can identify the author, the main claim of the text, and the related evidence. How do they evaluate author's expertise, author's benevolence, and quality of evidence with a 6-point scale? And then how do they justify the evaluations? And we have a multiple choice version, but then we have also another version where also some open-ended questions for students. And we have already, in the previous project, already collected some data from 6th graders. And this figure illustrates the findings concerning students' evaluations of expertise, benevolence, and evidence that they rated with a 6-point scale. And we tested 4 different structures for sixth graders' credibility evaluation. And actually the most complex structure fitted best to our data, and this structure is represented here. And what it tells us that somehow the text genre matters for students' evaluation, but most importantly, it shows that sixth graders need to separate latent skills when they are evaluating online information. They need ability to confirm the credibility of more credible texts, and they need an ability to question the less credible texts. And this questioning of less credible texts was much more difficult for sixth graders than confirming the credibility of more credible texts. And the other instrument that we are currently have been developing in this project is critical graph reading assessment. And we want to understand students' abilities to read and interpret graphs, but also their abilities to identify misleading elements of the graphs. And these kind of misleading graphs are based on valid data, but the appearance of the graphs has been manipulated to distort the message of the graphs. So how well do students pay attention to these elements where they can recognize these kind of misleading purposes? And I already told that we are now doing the data collection, and we are collecting data from fourth graders, sixth graders, eighth graders, and students who are first year either in the upper secondary school or vocational school. And we are using the same text and multiple choice questions for across these age groups. And we want to understand how these cross-sectionally how these skills develop across the grade levels. And our aim is to formulate recommendations that are age appropriate for students. And that was all for me now, and I'm looking forward to share some evidence in the near future. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Kirsi Pulkkinen and I come from the Finnish Science Center Association, and I'm here to represent the Finski project. If I may have my slides, please. While the slides are coming on, I will continue to mention that Finski stands for Fostering Finnish Science Capital. And now, from the first beginning, I would like to make it clear that we also are funded by the Strategic Research Council in Finland, so in the same program as the project that Karita just presented. So when we are talking about Finski and Science Capital, this is a long-term project, of course, also comprising of a number of universities in Turku, Helsinki and Eastern Finland, and then Heureka and the Finnish Science Center Association, which means 10 different science centers in different parts of the country. And also Scope, which is taking care of our communication and interaction activities. But Science Capital, it's a term that many now hopefully have heard. It was coined in the UK context, so the meaning of science to begin with is slightly different from what it means in Finland and the Nordic countries. So when we talk about science capital in the Finski project, we refer to all disciplines, not only STEM or the natural sciences, but every discipline and all the differences and the variations that they include. So science capital is something that could mean a lot of different things. What we mean is a multitude of things that are all interconnected. So not only what a person knows, the actual content or substance of scientific knowledge and their science literacy as such, but also their trust in the abilities, the capabilities that they have to understand scientific knowledge. Secondly, it's not only about this knowledge, but how they think about that knowledge and the significance that science and science-related information has in their daily lives. So this is not only some abstract form of information in their lives, but something that they utilize in their everyday normal context, whether it is linked to how they think about health issues or education or, well, moving around in different ways. Thirdly, it is about what people do with this information and knowledge that they have. So how the scientific interests that they have actually formulates in their actual lives. Do they read scientific information in different ways, or listen to podcasts, or go to science centers and so on? So how does it appear in normal daily routines? And fourthly, it's about who they know. Do people know researchers or medical doctors, teachers, other professionals who are trained in science in different ways? So the societal or social context that people have is very much related to the science knowledge and their skills, their attitudes towards science, and the activities that take place in everyday lives. And also, science capital has a direct link to the different opportunities and choices that we see on educational and career paths, including those choices we make in adult life. So in Finski, our approach is not only the youth or adolescents and children, but we're talking about all age groups, all throughout life. So why does Finski exist then? As Karita also just mentioned, there is an abundance of information that is available, but it is becoming more and more difficult to see which is trustworthy and which is not, and which can we follow and make decisions on, and which we should discard. As I mentioned, these are all related to normal everyday activities like our health choices or whether you should vaccinate or not. We make decisions based on the knowledge that we have. If our science capital is higher, we expect that people would then make these decisions based on research-based knowledge rather than something else. So the likelihood of being subjected to some kind of hoaxes or misinformation is lesser. And also at a societal level, the polarization of opinions and manipulation can be taken down somewhat. So a more comfortable society based on research-based knowledge for all of us. Now, this also means that science capital has a direct link to equity and the social access that we have to knowledge. We know from previous research that this is not the case. We do not have the same approaches or the same possibilities to access scientific information, even if we all go to the same schooling systems and so on. So we need to be able to look at these things both in formal education as well as the informal learning context that follow us throughout our lifetime. In Finski, we have a scientific vision that is, of course, to produce new knowledge about scientific thinking and how science capital is fostered and accumulated, but also to evaluate how this knowledge can be applied in different kinds of contexts. So to do this, we combine different theoretical and disciplinary approaches. So I would even say we go beyond the multidisciplinary and to transdisciplinary approaches and develop research methods on this basis. But a very important part of the scientific work is also to engage those who could benefit from research. And this is done in a very co-creative manner in different ways. So we work in direct collaboration with different sorts of people and groups and communities, especially focusing on those who do not currently have access or have lesser access to scientific knowledge. So our areas of research are rather broad. The people in University of Turku are looking at the emotions in knowledge acquisition, as well as future citizen science literacy and everyday decision making. At the University of Helsinki, there are colleagues looking at the neurocognitive processes in decision making. The University of Eastern Finland are looking at parent science capital and how this is related to children's science literacy. At the science centers, we look at the democratization of science and in particular the informal science learning context. And then of course we have a specific part on engagement and interaction with the population. Our societal vision is of course directly linked to this, but somewhat different in how we work with it. So we're talking about enhancing the interest and trust towards science and doing this in direct collaboration with the people whose interests and trusts we hope to influence. These are people from all walks of life in different age groups and different parts of society. We're looking at enhancing possibilities to use scientific knowledge in decision making, and this is both at the normal everyday level of all of us, but also in public decision making at the top of society. And then the ability to evaluate the reliability of information, which my colleague Karita just discussed, so I will not go more deeply into that. So we're doing both research and development. We're very intrigued to know how the four branches of Science Capital actually function in relation to themselves, what the dynamics are. We know that they are linked, but how their subcomponents actually link, that is not yet known. So this is what we're trying to both understand and then develop into work practices and so on. Our collaboration is through multiple channels, of course, within the consortium and with Finnish residents of all sorts, and in partnerships with, for example, civil society organizations or and other types of public organizations that work in relation to these different sectors. And as I mentioned, again, this collaboration pays specific attention to those whose access to science and the world of science around it is limited for different reasons. So we're trying to find the unseen hinders and take them down. Now, when it comes to the science centers, we have our own work package, as you noticed, but our part in the research development activities is a bit specific. We run different types of experiments, and they are based on an idea of cyclical evaluation and co-creation. So when we work with, for example, youth, we are currently running experiments with youth. They are not only taking part in different experiments, but they also get to evaluate how it works and give us some further ideas on how we should do things better, what works, what doesn't work, and then we build these into pilots that they again come to evaluate. And in this double diamond way of working, we can utilize the lessons we learned throughout the entire project. So what we learn with the youth, it hopefully can be utilized to work with people in the elderly part of populations. So it's to develop new practices and work methods, to build new partnerships that we may not see at the moment, but that could really push the idea of Finski forward. And to scale these tools so that they can be adapted to different kinds of contexts and environments, and then used openly and shared openly with anyone working within the field. So it's very much about cross-organizational learning for all of us. So in short, it's about a change of perspective, currently we know that there's an overemphasis on the interests of the socioeconomically advantaged and highly educated people. And we want to move beyond this to identify the obstacles that hinder other people, different sorts of minorities, for example, from accessing the world of science. So we would get more diversity and again, a stronger science capital also at a societal level. So we're talking about individual as well as shared capital. And moving from the traditional view of science centers or researchers and experts, somewhat top-down, what do we want the audiences to understand, we move to a new way of looking at the view of multiple types of audiences. So not only the current ones, but in particular those who are now excluded. So what is important to them? What is meaningful to them in substance and in the ways that we work with them? So it's a bottom-up process, bottom-up and then back again, and stressing the importance of participation and co-creation, and less talk about target groups and rather about the people being active actors in themselves. Now, if you'd be interested in participating, we have a lot of different channels to do that. Here are some of them, and much of this information is placed on our website, which you see at the bottom of the page. So you're very welcome to follow us and be part of this project in different ways and make contact with us. We're also on social media. You can find all of the different channels of finding us. So we'd be happy to see you come involved in our project. Thank you.
I have the task to moderate the question and answers part. And it's a relatively easy task because we kind of failed to send a link for the questions. But it doesn't mean that we don't answer to your questions. You have been hearing and seeing different type of presentations this afternoon. We all, different groups, let's say we started by fact-checking organization who has decided to do media and information literacy. We learned about the digital information literacy. We heard the importance of the science education by Professor Jonathan Osborne. We have learned that there is a new critical group studying the reading skills and online reading capacities of our children in the schools. And yes, at the last we had a Finski group telling about what they do. And in fact, we all speak same language. We are speaking about same approach, but let's say from the different angles. And I have to say that this is a blessing to do work in this field in Finland. We have different organizations, NGOs, project groups, universities, and we can work together because we feel that this is a hugely important issue. And instead of spending on Friday afternoon time for questions and answers, I will invite Mikko Salo, the founder of the Faktabaari, to come and wrap up the session. On my behalf, I thank you all, and especially Heureka and the technicians of Heureka for excellent work. And you can find these recordings later on, and Mikko will explain how. Thank you, and I wish you a good weekend.
So, hello again, and it pretty much leaves after quite an exclusive setting to thank people and to advise on the following steps, and especially the ones that Kari mentioned on where you can find this recording, for example. So this is faktabaari.fi/edu, and there you got all our materials. You can also follow us on at Faktabaari, or in English at Factbar. That's where we are going soon after this one as well. I would then still refer to the richness of the debates, and I came up to the idea that basically, based on these either individual contributions or joining the contribution as we have heard it, you are very happy to organize your own Faktabaari, so invite some, let's say, like-minded, or not necessarily like-minded, but a group of people and debate about these ones. There is nothing absolute truth, so to say, but this kind of different type of approaches where we try to make sense of the reality as we see it at the moment. So I think this recording that you can find on our website immediately after the setting might serve as a kind of catalyst for that one. This said, I will also very much personally and probably join with you, start waiting for the final report of the Teaching Critical and Evaluative Thinking in Science, so Jonathan's led group, for their contributions, because I believe that will be a very important contribution for the even, let's say, on the global level. As we heard, it's like something like 3 to 4 months, but we will announce it, of course, and I mean they will all announce on their respective channels at that stage. Finally, just very much thank you to, of course, Jonathan as our very honored special guest, our Finnish fellow literacy colleagues and friends, all of you, of course, there behind the screen. Thank you for your patience on Friday evening, and naturally, of course, very much to Heureka, who has been very kindly hosting us with wonderful technological help and technical help, and finally then the US Embassy for making possible to invite Jonathan to address us here from Finland, but for the let's say global audience as such. With this, I just wish you a very nice weekend, and join our fact-based Faktabaari movement. Cheers.